Would members and their guests please take their seats? The committee will come to order. Today I'm pleased to chair the first legislative markup of the Ways and Means Committee for the 116th Congress. We have three bills before us today that are the product of bipartisan collaboration, and I think they are a testament to the fact that the Ways and Means Committee is where we find solutions and try to get things done for the American people. I want to be clear with members on both sides of the aisle that as chairman I always hold members to the highest standards of decorum, and how we debate these difficult issues that surely will be before us this year is very important, and how we treat each other when we sit on the dais reflects not only our individual character but also the respect for the institution and this committee on which we serve. So let me now turn to the bills before us today. Notably, we are considering a measure that represents a major bipartisan accomplishment for this committee. The Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act, or the SECURE Act. One of my priorities as chairman of this committee is helping American workers of all ages prepare for a financially secure retirement. So I'm delighted to be marking up this legislation today. I think it's particularly fitting that we're acting on this bill since April is Financial Literacy Month. I'd like to thank Ranking Member Brady and Representatives Kind and Kelly for joining me on this bill. And I believe that Mr. Buchanan had a hand as well. In fact, I want to take a minute to recognize Representative Kind and Representative Kelly for their leadership on this issue. Representative Kind has been a longtime champion of retirement issues, and he was the sponsor of the multi-employer provision that will be added by a substitute amendment. This provision will make it easier for small businesses to offer retirement plans to their employees and will result in the formation of an estimated 700,000 new retirement accounts. Representative Kelly deserves to be recognized as a leader on these issues. He has remained committed to working together to get retirement legislation over the finish line, and I'm pleased that we could do that today. Unfortunately, many Americans face a retirement income crisis, with too many people in danger of not having enough in retirement to maintain their standard of living and avoid sliding into poverty. Social Security benefits are modest, recalling that they average just short of $16,000 a year for the average recipient. Employer-sponsored pensions are disappearing, and too many Americans find it difficult to save for retirement. The SECURE Act goes a long way in addressing this problem by making it easier for Americans to save. For example, the legislation includes a small employer automatic enrollment credit. Automatic enrollment has been shown to increase employee participation and retirement savings. Our bill creates a new tax credit of up to $500 a year to employers to defray startup costs for a new Section 401k plan that includes automatic enrollment, which is really important. The SECURE Act also allows long-term, part-time workers to participate in their employers' 401k plans. Women are more likely to work part-time than men, so this legislation is particularly important for women, and I want to thank Representative Murphy for her leadership in this area. This landmark legislation, and I hope all of our colleagues will join in supporting it today, is important. I'm also pleased to announce that Ranking Member Brady and I will continue to work on additional retirement bills, and we have some pretty substantive proposals in mind. While we're taking an important step today, much more needs to be done, and over coming months, the Ranking Member and I plan to put together another bill that will close the coverage gap, simplify the retirement system, and help Americans preserve their assets in retirement. I hope that our committee colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, will come to us with ideas as we go forward. My goal is to mark up this second retirement bill before the August recess. And again, I want to thank the Ranking Member, Mr. Brady, for working with me on this important issue. Now, turning to the other bills before us today, H.R. 1759, the Bridge for Workers Act, is a bipartisan piece of legislation sponsored by Representative Stephanie Murphy. The bill builds on legislation that was enacted last year to expand and improve access to reemployment services for workers who received earned unemployment benefits while looking for new jobs. That legislation assisted workers and also saved taxpayer money. Representative Murphy's bill makes a simple but very important change to the law to make it even more effective by allowing states to tailor their programs to help any recipient of unemployment benefits to get back to work faster, rather than limiting these important supports to those who are expected to remain unemployed until their benefits run out. The final bill we will consider today is the Taxpayer First Act of 2019, which would, among other things, strengthen and help to modernize the IRS, improve taxpayer services, and protect Americans from identity theft. I want to applaud the Oversight Committee Subcommittee Chairman John Lewis and Ranking Member Mike Kelly for their leadership on this package. Chairman Lewis has been a strong advocate for this bill, which sailed through the House 3 times last year. I am pleased that this bill enjoys bicameral support and has been introduced by Senate Finance Chairman Grassley and Ranking Member Wyden. The Taxpayer First Act contains many provisions that would help low and moderate income taxpayers. For example, one important provision would codify the existing IRS free file program under which the IRS partners with the tax preparation community to offer free online tax filing to people whose incomes fall below the bottom 70%. I've been a longtime champion of free file programs and similar initiatives. Another important provision would codify the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, which under the IRS partners with nonprofit and community groups to offer income tax assistance to people with low incomes, limited English skills, or other barriers to tax compliance. I want to thank the Oversight Committee members for their hard work and encourage our colleagues on both sides to support this legislation as well. Now let me yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Brady, for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Neal, for calling today's markup. I'm encouraged we're moving on bipartisan proposals that will continue to boost our growing economy. And I especially want to thank all the members and professional staff who've worked tirelessly this year and past to get these important measures ready for committee consideration. The time is right for these bipartisan reforms. With wages continuing to rise for low-income workers, more job openings than there are workers to fill them, and financial optimism at near all-time highs, all 3 of the bills we're considering today will help this economic success continue for years to come. With the new tax code, it is time for a new tax administrator. The Taxpayer First Act, led by Mike Kelly and Oversight Chairman John Lewis, are the first structural reforms to the IRS in over 2 decades. The House passed almost identical measures nearly unanimously multiple times last year. These reforms will transform the IRS into an agency with a singular mission: quality taxpayer service. We're refocusing the agency to live up to its mission of serving taxpayers, improving information technology and cybersecurity, and reining in its enforcement powers to prevent future abuse. I'm glad that working together in a bipartisan, bicameral fashion, we're able to move these important IRS reforms forward. Additionally, we are considering the SECURE Act, Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act. With the economy growing at its fastest pace in years, now is the perfect time to help folks save more and earlier for retirement. Similar legislation passed the House last year with Democrat support as part of our Tax Reform 2.0 package. This legislation we are considering today, which builds upon that and continues to improve, will help families ensure they have the flexibility and control over their savings to be prepared for whatever life throws their way. Mike Kelly and Ron Kind led the efforts on these reforms, and I'm optimistic we will send this legislation to the President's desk this year. I want to say thank you to you leaders for this great work today. And as the Chairman said, I look forward to working with Chairman Neal on even more important reforms that will help workers save more and save earlier for retirement. Finally, we are considering legislation to make an important timely update to our nation's unemployment insurance program. While I'm disappointed the committee didn't exercise its jurisdiction over the unemployment insurance provisions being considered on the House floor this week, I am proud that we are taking bipartisan action today to look out for workers. With a record number of job openings, we need to do all we can to ensure we're getting these laid off workers through no fault of their own back into the workforce as quickly as possible. The BRIDGE Act, the Building on Reemployment Improvements to Deliver Good Employment for Workers Act, that was a mouthful, is an important step forward in these efforts. In this bipartisan bill led by committee members Jackie Walorski, Darren LaHood, and Stephanie Murphy, we are building on the reemployment services offered by the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. And this does so by making permanent a technical correction we first made in appropriations for FY 2019. clarifying the states have the flexibility to provide reemployment services and eligibility assessments, not just those likely to exhaust their unemployment benefits, but to all those where these services could help speed reemployment. It's a smart thing. Increasing state flexibility to determine who receives these services and when, based on the needs of their communities, instead of based on the needs of Washington, D.C., it's critical to minimizing disruption on their families. America needs these workers. Main Street needs these workers. More importantly, children need to see their parents going to work, showing them the way, and these reemployment services will help make that happen sooner. Once again, I thank Chairman Neal for holding today's markup and for working with us on these important proposals. I'm proud to support all these measures, and I look forward to continuing to work together throughout this Congress on bipartisan bills that give families and Main Street businesses the tools they need to succeed in today's growing economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Our first order of business is H.R. 1759, the Bridge for Workers Act, which would improve upon the committee's work last Congress on a bipartisan budget act to ensure that Americans who lost their jobs are receiving unemployment benefits they earned and are trying to return to work as quickly as possible. Let me commend the sponsor of this legislation, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, for her leadership and bipartisan work on the legislation. I now yield to her for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Neal and Ranking Member Brady, thank you for holding today's legislative markup, the first our committee has conducted this Congress. And I thank you for including the bipartisan bill I introduced called the Bridge for Workers Act among the 3 bills that we will consider this morning. I'm a new member of this committee, and so this is a real honor. I also want to express my gratitude to the 3 original co-sponsors of this legislation. They are Congresswoman Walorski, the ranking member of the Worker and Family Support Subcommittee, Congresswoman Torres Small, and Congressman LaHood. Finally, I want to thank Chairman Danny Davis and his staff for all the work they have done to prepare this bill for markup. The goal of this bill is to provide workers who are receiving unemployment benefits with the support they need to get back into the workforce as quickly as possible so that they can once again provide for their families and feel the sense of dignity that comes with earning a paycheck. As background, the U.S. Department of Labor makes annual grants to states and territories who use these grants to provide a range of services to recipients of unemployment benefits to help them find work. Services include career counseling, assistance with job searches, and information on the local job market. Under current law, states can only use their federal grants to assist workers who are expected to exhaust their unemployment benefits before they find work. That's an unnecessary restriction that prevents many unemployed workers from getting valuable assistance. Our bill would remove this restriction and allow states to use their grants to provide support to any individual receiving unemployment benefits, as long as the state believes those services would help the individual return to work more quickly. We provided a 1-year patch in the 2019 appropriations bill to make this change temporarily, but this bill would make it permanent. This is critical because research shows the longer workers are out of work, the harder it can be to maintain their skills, professional networks, and stable home life. By combining targeted reemployment services with unemployment insurance benefits, we will keep people attached to the labor force who might otherwise become discouraged and give up looking for a job. In my home state of Florida, it is estimated this bill could provide up to 25,000 additional individuals claiming unemployment benefits each week with access to reemployment services. I must note that Florida would do even better if it were to improve access to unemployment benefits to match other states, but that's an issue for another day. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a letter of endorsement from the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, the nonpartisan national organization representing the workforce agencies of all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. territories. I respectfully ask my colleagues to support the Bipartisan Bridge for Workers Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentlelady. And now I would like to recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, who also had a major sponsorship in this legislation, Ms. Walorski, for purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased we're marking up the Bridge for Workers Act, which I've worked on with my colleagues, Representatives Murphy and LaHood. This legislation builds upon the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, where we made a significant step forward in helping those unemployed through no fault of their own by pairing unemployment benefits with services. Over the last few decades, there's been a focus on automation that has removed all human interaction from the benefit claims process. Beneficiaries really have become just another number entered into a spreadsheet or a computer database. During the last recession, we saw that merely providing 99 weeks of unemployment benefits was not enough to help individuals return to the workforce. That's why in 2012 we offered reemployment services and eligibility assessments known as RESAs to the long-term unemployed based on successful state efforts to engage UI beneficiaries. Since the recession, many states have rebranded unemployment to reemployment and focused efforts to promote rapid reemployment because it's better for workers, their families, and an economy where we have 1 million more job openings than we actually have unemployed. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 provides states with funding certainty so they can invest in these services and serve a greater number of workers. That's why H.R. 1759 is so important. It makes permanent a technical correction first made in FY 2019 appropriations to clarify that reemployment services and eligibility assessments shall promote quicker reemployment to shorten benefit durations for all unemployment insurance claimants, not just those most likely to exhaust unemployment benefits. In my home state of Indiana, RESA was redesigned in 2016 to assist UI claimants through early intervention, to aid in a quicker return to meaningful employment and eliminate UI fraud. Indiana's RESA program is twofold. The initial RESA expects beneficiaries to make an in-person visit to a Work One center on approximately the 6th week of benefits. During that visit, they attend an orientation to learn more about the services and then meet with a RESA counselor for a one-on-one assessment interview to develop an individual reemployment plan. That plan may include workshops to improve job search or interviewing skills or referrals to other support or services beyond the UI agencies. Any of the RESA initial participants who are still collecting at the 15th week of their UI claim are contacted for re-engagement as part of the subsequent RESA program. These long-term claimants are brought in for a one-on-one reassessment interview to determine if additional barriers to reemployment are present. At any point in the process where it becomes apparent that additional, more intensive services are needed, the customer then moves into WIOA services. RESAs are a valuable reemployment tool to those that have lost their job through no fault of their own. And for that reason, I urge all my colleagues to support H.R. 1759, the Bridge for Workers Act. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1759. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. Let me now turn to Morna Miller, Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Worker and Family Support, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask members to hold their questions until after her presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following the original bill, H.R. 1759, the Building on Reemployment Improvements to Deliver Good Employment for Workers, or Bridge for Workers Act, the amendment in the nature of a substitute includes two parts. The first part outlines a number of findings about the demonstrated effectiveness and cost-effectiveness of reemployment services and eligibility assessment, or RESA grants, which are awarded to states and territories by the Department of Labor and used to fund personalized return-to-work services for individuals receiving earned unemployment benefits. The second part modifies Section 306A of the Social Security Act to allow the use of RESA grants to provide return-to-work support to any recipient of unemployment insurance benefits that the state or territory believes could return to work more quickly with extra assistance. Without this statutory change, the Department of Labor interprets the law as limiting the use of the grants to providing services for unemployment insurance recipients who are expected to exhaust their unemployment benefits before they find new work. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes two clerical changes. In the long title, it changes compensation to benefits, and on page 2, it removes the hyphens from the phrase out of work. I would be happy to answer any questions the members of the committee have about the legislation.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Let me recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Currently, states are only able to utilize re-employment services grants to help workers expected to exhaust their unemployment benefits. In fiscal year 19, New Jersey received over $2.3 million in re-employment services and eligibility assessment state grants. Under the Bridge for Workers Act, New Jersey would be able to use those dollars to support anyone who's receiving unemployment benefits. These services allow early intervention, critical in terms of unemployment, to reduce long-term unemployment and shorten unemployment benefit durations. I support this successful program and the underlying bill. I thank you, and I yield back.
Is there anybody else who wishes to be recognized? The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I commend my colleagues, Congresswoman Murphy, Congresswoman Walorski, Congresswoman Torres Small, and Congressman LaHood for continuing our committee's important work on reemployment services by introducing the Bridge for Workers Act. Workers receiving earned unemployment benefits work hard trying to find jobs, but when you lose your job, it can be difficult to find a new one, especially if you're older, haven't looked for a job in a long time, and maybe have made some mistakes in the past. Reemployment services give people looking for work the personal help they need to overcome those barriers. For instance, states might provide trained staff who can provide assistance targeted to a claimant's needs. Things like customized career and labor market information, help with application materials, or allowing them to practice for tough job interviews. This bill ensures more workers can benefit from these tools. That means more workers will find jobs and better jobs and more quickly. Even in times of low unemployment, it's important to help people get back to work quickly. It is particularly important for lower paid workers who often can't save much and have nothing but very modest unemployment benefits to live on. And although overall unemployment rates are low, this prosperity is not shared equally. In my state of Illinois, the unemployment rate is still more than 10% higher than the national average. Unemployment levels for African American men with a high school education, many of whom live in my congressional district in Chicago, are more than 40% lower than they were in 2007. Our work on reemployment services and on this bill shows how much good work we can do when we work together. I'm proud to support this bill, commend my colleagues for its introduction, and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from California would like to strike the last word. Ms. Chu?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I'm supportive of the Bridge Act, which would ensure that all unemployment insurance beneficiaries could use reemployment service grants to get back to work, not just those unemployed individuals who are likely to exhaust their unemployment benefits. I know this would make an impact in my district in Pasadena, California. The Employment Development Department there administers the RESA program, which offers an orientation to dislocated workers. At the orientation, the clients are given a tour of all the services available, including partner services under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and then are able to pick a service that best fits their need. Additional resources for the RESA program will allow all individuals to have access to this program and help coordinate services better so that staff can help those individuals apply for this so that the unemployed don't have to figure it out on their own. And this would help more dislocated workers in my community find work more quickly. Last week, I met with the LA County Workforce Development Board, and they told me the story of Hector. Hector lost his job as an account manager where he was making $44.71 per hour. It forced him to seek public assistance to make ends meet for himself and his family. Through the help of the staff at the East Los Angeles West San Gabriel Valley America's Job Center of California, Hector was able to receive a referral for an interview with the Mainco Corporation and was provided a bus pass that enabled him to get to the interview. He was able to quickly secure employment as a finance controller and is now making $55 an hour, which is $11 more than when he lost his job. So we must pass this bill and make sure that individuals who lose their jobs are not out of the workforce too long. I applaud my colleague Stephanie Murphy for introducing this bill, and I hope that we can have it signed into law quickly. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady, and with that, let me recognize the gentleman from New York who wishes to strike the last word, Mr. Suozzi.
Mr. Chairman, the American people are hungering for members of Congress to work together to actually solve the problems we face in our country, and I want to thank you for your leadership in trying to promote bipartisanship and encouraging people to work together to solve the very real problems that we face here in the country. And I want to congratulate my colleague, Stephanie Murphy, on introducing this bill as a new member of this committee, and for the work and cooperation of Representative Walorski. I yield back my time.
Is there anyone else who would like to strike the last word? The gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to applaud my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for this common sense bipartisan legislation. My top priority as a member of Congress has always been to expand economic opportunities and fight for jobs in my district. I'm glad that we're considering this common sense legislation today to expand access to reemployment services and help people get back to work. While many areas of the country have bounced back from the 2008 financial crisis and are facing a period of economic prosperity, too many people in rural America, and especially in rural Alabama that I represent, are still struggling to find work. The services provided to job seekers as a result of reemployment service grants are invaluable to workers trying to get back on their feet. I hope the increased investment in the program provided by the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 will jumpstart the livelihoods of people in my community and throughout the country. I'm proud to support this bipartisan piece of legislation to ensure that all people receive unemployment benefits or able to access the resources from the Reemployment Services Program. The quicker people get back to work, the quicker they can provide for their families and regain financial security. I want to thank my colleague, Congresswoman Murphy, as well as my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for leading this effort, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentlelady, and with that, let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and like you, I believe this is very good work. I'm glad we're moving this forward. But while we are talking about unemployment insurance, a system funded by employers for those who lose their job through no fault of their own, I want to raise another issue. Section 703 of H.R. 1585, the Violence Against Women reauthorization, which is scheduled for floor action later this week. I'm disappointed we're not considering this provision, which makes permanent program changes with mandatory spending costs as part of today's markup, because the majority side instead to waive consideration. This committee, one of our major jurisdictions, does the unemployment insurance program, but Section 703 is a permanent unemployment insurance benefit expansion that did not receive a single hearing or a markup for formal debate before this committee. Section 703 also amends the temporary assistance for needy families program, again with no hearing or markup. In fact, when this committee held a multi-day markup of the TANF program last year, this provision was never raised. Beyond the process concerns that jeopardize the jurisdiction of this committee in the future, the policy issue, whether you use the UI systems, should be publicly and formally debated. As demonstrated by the second half of Section 703, we have other means, important ones, beyond using the UI system that's funded by employers to make sure we provide cash assistance to victims and train professionals on how to handle these very sensitive issues. And so as sitting in your chair, Mr. Chairman, I was often scolded about regular process in regular order.
Who would have said that?
I'll return that favor and so make the point I'm disappointed so early in the Congress it's been decided regular order is not necessary. I hope we can work together on these issues together in the future, ensure we debate fully any legislation that falls within the jurisdiction of our committee. And again, I support the underlying bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and I certainly appreciate the concerns that he has raised, and we are determined, as you know, to try to keep as much comity as we can. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Anybody else wish to be heard? If there are no further amendments to the question on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Now let me recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Lewis, for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1759 as amended to the House of Representatives.
We thank the gentleman. The question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 1759 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1759 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 1994, Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act of 2019, which will expand and preserve the retirement savings and make administrative simplifications to the retirement system. Let me take a moment to highlight some of our colleagues' priorities that made it into the bill. The Secure Act includes Representative Sanchez's H.R. 1688 legislation that would simplify the retirement plan filing process for small business. It also includes H.R. 1241, Representative Larson's legislation providing tax benefits for volunteer firefighters and emergency medical responders. It includes Representative Trahan's legislation that would create a new tax credit for small businesses that add automatic enrollment to their 401k plans. In addition, the legislation includes H.R. 1874, Representative Murphy's legislation allowing long-time part-time workers to participate in 401k plans. The bill includes H.R. 1916, Representative Del Benny's legislation providing pension funding relief to community newspapers. The Secure Act also includes H.R. 1932, which allows certain home health care workers to contribute to a defined contribution plan or individual retirement account. The bill was introduced by Representative Schreier and Del Benny as a priority of Ways and Means Democratic members from California and Oregon. Finally, we included a fix to the non-discrimination rules for older workers that was important to Representative Horsford. Now, let me recognize Mr. Kine, who has been a leader on this topic and is the original co-sponsor of this bill, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to thank and commend you and the Ranking Member Brady for your intense focus and interest in enhancing retirement savings opportunity in this country. Obviously, with the litany that you just ran off, there's a lot of fingerprints on this legislation, and rightly so. It's long overdue, and it makes sense. I recall roughly 10 years ago, our former friend and colleague on the committee, Mr. Reichert, and I introduced the SAVE Act, which became the basis of the iteration that later became RISA. I was happy to introduce that with my friend, colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, over the last few years. And also a standalone open MEPS bill, multi-employer plan bill, with my friend from Florida, Mr. Buchanan, which is also included in this legislation. But I also want to just take a moment to commend former Chairman Dave Camp. When he took a serious run, I felt, at comprehensive tax reform, he instituted a group of bipartisan task force to dive into the code. And I was proud to chair one of the task force along with Pat Tiberi, a former colleague, on retirement savings and pension law. And that, too, became the basis of a lot of what we see in this underlying bill today. And the reason it's long overdue is because 94% of the workers working in large businesses, employees with over 500, have access to a retirement savings plan. Yet we have over 50 million Americans today that don't have access, that are working in private businesses. Most of them are in small businesses. In fact, 60% of the workers in small businesses don't have access to retirement savings opportunities like other people do. That's what this legislation is meant to correct in part, is that black hole of retirement savings, especially in the small business world, by making it easier for them to form multi-employer plans so they can join forces and through economies of scale offer these plans to their employees, create some safe havens for them, have some financial incentives to make sure that the financial burden isn't what's holding them back. And then with the auto sign-up, the auto escalation, that's meant to overcome the great inertia of just getting people to do something in their own personal retirement savings. So this legislation was needed, and by estimates and some of the analysis of this bill, that when it goes into effect, close to 700,000 more employees will be able to, for the first time, sign up for their own personal retirement saving plan. Not a bad start. Also, there's a small provision in here, too, that provides PBGC premium relief for co-ops and for many small nonprofit because of the overpayment that they were making within the system. It's going to make it easier for them to be able to meet their own pension obligations. And finally, Mr. Chairman, let me commend you again and the rest of the committee that for our first markup of the year, we've got 3 strong bipartisan bills that we're moving forward on. And in this environment of intense partisanship and polarization, I believe this committee especially needs to stand up and find ways that we can be respectful to each other, civil to one another, listen to each other, work hard to find those areas of common ground, which is reflected in these 3 bills today. And hopefully it's something that we can build upon here in this committee and show the rest of the Congress really what the American people expect coming out of their federal government these days. I know you and the ranking member have great interest in pursuing more retirement savings opportunity as the year progresses. I know I, and I'm sure others, are looking forward to working with you in a constructive and bipartisan basis and see what we can continue to do to enhance retirement savings security, for all Americans in this country. So with that, I encourage support for the legislation, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Brady, for purposes of an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Neal. I want to thank you, Representative Mike Kelly, Representative Vern Buchanan, Representative Ron Kind, for their work on this important bill. Many of the provisions were included in the Family Savings Act and H.R. 88, 2 bills that passed the House last year. Today's legislation doesn't include some important policies from those 2 previously passed bills, such as USA accounts, as well as allowing families to save an extra year for those soon-to-be newborn babies. But nonetheless, this is a very strong package of important reforms. It's well-deserving of strong bipartisan support from this committee. We know the biggest factor affecting the ability of Americans to save, ensure that our kids and grandkids are better off than the generation before them, is sustained economic growth. In a slow-growth economy with stagnant paychecks and jobs moving overseas, it's hard for families to get ahead and plan for the future. Thanks to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and balanced regulation, we're experiencing a strong level of economic growth. We're the strongest level in years. Today, unemployment's at historic lows. Wages are rising at the fastest pace for blue-collar workers. Families are now able to keep more of their hard-earned income. This is the perfect time to further encourage all Americans prepare for their futures by helping them save more and earlier for whatever life throws their way. As we heard in our February hearing, data shows that Americans are participating in retirement plans at a solid rate. In fact, many families now have the far higher savings today than they did years ago. Much of this is because of the great success of 401k plans and IRAs, and these savings tools give families control over their retirement planning. When to save, how much to save, how to invest, and when to draw down. But we know we can do more. That's what this bill is about, to make these vehicles even more user-friendly. The Bipartisan Secure Act will help families save more and earlier in a variety of ways by making important reforms to the rules regarding 401ks and IRAs. Specifically, our bill will make it easier for Main Street businesses to offer retirement plans to their workers. It does so by reducing paperwork burdens and administrative costs and giving them more flexibility. The Secure Act will also allow workers to continue to save longer. Our workforce has changed dramatically over the past few years. Americans are living and working longer. It's important that our tax laws reflect that. So our bill eliminates the current age limits for making contributions to traditional IRAs, allowing older Americans to continue to save. This bill will also give older Americans more time before they're required to start pulling from their accounts. increasing the age from 70 and a half under current law to instead 72 years of age. In addition, the Secure Act creates new flexible savings opportunities for families and individuals. In the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we included incredibly important reforms that expand the uses of 529 education accounts. This Secure Act builds on those reforms by expanding 529s even further. We're allowing 529 funds to be used for additional education costs to help even more folks, including expansion to help with costs of apprenticeships, the expenses of homeschooling, and the burden of student debt. The bill also allows families to access their own retirement savings penalty-free at the time of their birth or adoption of the child. This new baby savings provisions, bringing a new child into a home, is one of the most exciting times for families. This bill will help provide peace of mind for more moms and more dads. It'll also give them the ability to recontribute any of these funds in the future to replenish their retirement savings. With the reforms in the Secure Act, our tax code will give Americans more flexibility to save in a manner that they believe best. Chairman, it is a great way to continue to improve the pro-growth tax code we have today and work together, as has been said, to encourage more people to save. I encourage all my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1994. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. Now let me turn to Tom Barthold, the Staff Director of the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask members to hold their questions until Mr. Barthold has concluded his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members of the committee have before them 4 joint committee documents describing the underlying legislation, JCX 11 and JCX 12, and documents describing the underlying, the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute and the estimated budgetary effects of the proposal in JCX 13 and 14. I will highlight just some of the major components of this legislation, some of which were noted in the opening statements. First of all, it makes reforms to multiple employer plans. For multiple employer defined contribution plans, it permits that multiple employer plans under prior law generally had to be formed by employers with a common interest. The current legislation would mean that a plan not be based necessarily on common interest and directs the IRS to provide guidance for qualifying plan administrators so that multiple employers can join in a common plan. It also provides relief that would otherwise against actions of one employer which could disqualify the entire plan. The legislation also repeals the maximum age for IRA contributions, which is currently at age 70 and a half. It removes that age limit. It permits withdrawals and on a penalty-free basis and recontribution to retirement plans of up to $5,000 per individual in the case of a birth or adoption by that individual. It increases the age threshold for when a taxpayer must start to begin taking required minimum distributions from a retirement plan. Currently, age 70 and a half, it increases that threshold age to age 72. It modifies and reduces certain PBGC premiums, in particular premiums paid by cooperative organizations and small employer charities. Under present law, the flat rate premium of $80, and it would be reduced to $19 per participant, and the variable rate portion, currently $43 per $1,000 of unfunded vested benefit, would be reduced to $9 per $1,000. The legislation also modifies required distribution rules for designated beneficiaries in the case when an IRA owner or the employee, the beneficiary of a qualified defined contribution plan passes away. It makes a general rule that the proceeds of the IRA or the qualified plan must be distributed and brought into income of the heir over a 10-year period, with an exception for eligible beneficiaries, generally the spouse, minor children of the IRA owner or the employee, and in certain cases, disabled or chronically ill individuals. That includes a brief discussion of some of the high points of the legislation. Be happy to answer any questions that the members might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Kind, Mr. Pascrell? We'll alternate back and forth here. So I'll get some help here from staff. Mr. Kind, I think, had his hand up first.
I did. I had a question for Mr. Barthold. Mr. Barthold, you just described the pay for the offset to pay for this legislation. That's commonly referred to as a stretch IRA. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the colloquial term that's been batted around in the Congress. Yes, sir.
So we're just bringing that income into play at a shorter period of time, over 10 years.
Well, it changes the general rules. There were some provisions that required 5 years, so in some cases it's actually a little bit longer. But the general rule is now 10 years, except for those eligible beneficiaries, primarily spouse and minor children.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy we're proceeding. There was a cost associated with the bill. We did find a very acceptable bipartisan offset. Actually, it was an idea that Senator Grassley had come up with a few years ago, so he's good with it. And happy to report that based on our contact with both Senators Grassley and Wyden, they're anxious to pick up this legislation and move it forthwith in the Senate as soon as we can send it over there. And I'm also happy that according to the score on this, not only are going to be covering the cost of this bill, but slightly more. So we can actually claim that this committee today will be reporting a bill out that is not only completely paid for, but will also help reduce the deficit in a little way. And when's the last time we can say that as a committee? So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, question for you. While this is, and let me just say this, while this bill has some really strong things that help retirement, help workers save for retirement and increase retirement security, I've got a question on the provision regarding community newspapers. It's really almost impossible to tell who the real beneficiaries of this are going to be because their data is protected by security in the IRS, correct?
Mr. Ferguson, the community newspaper provision that you refer to relaxes some funding rules for defined community newspapers. As a general matter, it has to be a family-owned, limited in terms of publication area. We've done, my colleagues on the staff have done some research on number of qualifying newspapers. There's actually a fair number of newspapers throughout the country that might qualify. We've identified more than 20. But in terms of specific names, because we did our research based on taxpayer information within the IRS, it's protected information, and I should not disclose it in an open markup.
Right. So we in this we don't really know the information about the owners. So we don't really know in this particular bill if someone that owns this newspaper may be worth hundreds of millions of dollars or $1 billion. We simply don't have access to that information right now. Correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. All right. So, but if you do have a community newspaper that has an owner that also, say, may own multiple other interests, and you can draw some conclusions about their net worth, correct?
Perhaps the legislation itself restricts the benefits to the controlled group of the owner at a certain date, so it cannot be expanded.
Sure.
It could be the case that a family owning a newspaper property, if it owned another business, could claim the benefits provided here for the other, or for the.
So you could have you could have an individual that's has a significant net worth that owns one of these papers that we are now giving the opportunity for them to purposely change their funding requirements and their responsibilities to their employees, and then we're giving them, we're allowing them with this bill to change that funding model to not only delay those contributions, but to change it. I just worry, sir, that this bill would, I'm not sure who the real beneficiaries of this are. I know we're claiming that it is the workers, the men and women that work at these newspapers. I certainly know that it's not the taxpayers, and I certainly know that it's not, I question whether or not it's these workers over the long term, and it may in fact be people that are worth really high net worths. I want to make myself clear. This overall bill is outstanding in terms of the retirement security, and I think that I applaud the chairman and the ranking members and Mr. Kind and Mr. Kelly and others on this committee for working so hard here. But I just wonder, in a day where there's all the questions about people of significant net worth getting a significant financial break on their responsibility and paying their fair share, I just wonder how that, I just question it. It makes me worry about the security of these workers. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
I thank the gentleman. So it's the chair's intention now to proceed on the basis of offering an opportunity for members to ask a question, and if not, then we will proceed to striking the last word. Are there any other questions? So what we're going to do in the regular order is those to be recognized on both sides who want to strike the last word. Okay. So with that, Mr. Larson, and then Buchanan, and then Kelly, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word, and I want to thank and underscore what's been said with respect to the bipartisan nature with this legislation is being put forward. I commend the chairman and the Republican leader for their efforts and ongoing and continued efforts, and I think all of us on this committee, as Mr. Kind said, are hopeful that we can set an example for this Congress and continue down this path as well. I also want to thank Mr. Kelly on two fronts, both for being a co-sponsor along with Mr. Kind, but also there's a provision in here that takes into consideration the Volunteer Responder Incentive Protection Act, which is something, well, we started introducing back when Bill Thomas was the chairman of this committee, and Chief Reichert, or Dave Reichert, was one of the co-sponsors of that bill because he understood the impact it had on volunteer firefighters. And I think everybody on this committee, between volunteer firefighters and emergency medical service, and something, again, that Mr. Kelly has joined in being a co-sponsor, recognize that it was rather unfair that the menial amount of benefits that so many communities were paying their volunteers would end up being taxed. And it just got caught up, however unintended or otherwise, in a process that didn't work for them. And all of us have that vision of those who are running up the stairs while those who are coming down to safety. And between emergency medical systems and people arriving on the scene and assisting people and the work that our volunteer firefighters do across this nation, this was an important aspect to be included within here. And again, I just wanted to thank the chairman and the ranking member, and of course Mr. Kind and Mr. Kelly as the primary sponsors of this bill, and the ability to take in common sense solutions like the volunteer firefighters and EMS. And I yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania to strike the last word, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also, if I could, I'd like to submit for the record numerous letters I have now on the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act.
So ordered.
And I want to thank Ranking Member Brady. Mr. Chairman, you and I sat down months ago and talked about the possibility of this coming together. This is a fantastic day, by the way. And I'm glad it's on April the 2nd, not April the 1st. But I look at what we're talking about today, and this is truly one of those days, and Mr. Kind referenced this already. I don't know that there's any time in my life that I've seen the American people more disappointed in the Congress. They're saying, why can't you all just work together? Why can't you do things that make sense for every single American? It doesn't have to be a red issue or a blue issue or a white issue. Why does it just be a red, white, and blue issue where we're taking care of the people who have funded this marvelous, marvelous government for so many years. So we're doing that today. This is a restoration of faith and trust that the American people need to have in this body, and we're doing it in a great way. Mr. Neal, you've been a leader on this for a long time, a long, long time. But also, and Ron talked about all the different fingerprints that are on this and the people that are involved. My good friend, Vern Buchanan, been working on MEPS for a long time, and there's so many things in there. But you know, the forgotten people, or the people that don't get the recognition, if I can, I'd just like to mention a few. Kara Getz. Now, I know that she works for you, but she's from the Steel City. So we like to claim her as one of ours also. And also, in addition to Ron, your staff, Hannah and Ethan, they work so hard in this stuff. And then Washington's pension guru, Kent Mason, and his sidekick, Chris Stevens, for all their unwavering support, saying, can't we get this done? And the answer is yes, we can. Yes, we can. So last night I looked over all the retirement bills that Ron and I have worked on together, starting with H.R. 3596, the Right Sizing Pension Premiums Act of 2017, and then the Retirement Enhancement and Savings Acts, which we both introduced in the 115th and 116th Congress. And Ron, I got to tell you, I look forward to working with you as we go into the future, because there's so many things we agree on for the people that we represent. But today's bill, the Secure Act, includes important provisions for the right-sizing pension premiums, RISA, and the Family Savings Act. This has truly been a joint effort. And there are provisions in this bill that everyone on this committee should be proud to vote for today. And we've already talked about some of the things when it comes to the PBGC relief for co-ops and charities, clarifies rules for church plans, and will help more small employers offer plans to their employees and help them save for retirement. The key problem remains that nearly half of American private sector employees, roughly 55 million Americans, work for an employer that does not offer a retirement plan. And most of these workers are employed in small businesses, the fastest growing of the segment of our economy. Look, there's so much in this bill. I know myself, from my personal experience. Starting in 1970, my father called me my first day at work and said, we're going to start with retirement plans for our people. And I said, why are you doing that? He says, well, you don't understand at 21 the importance of this, but I got to tell you right now, you need to start today preparing for your retirement. When we put that into effect at Kelly's Automotive Group, it was a huge, huge benefit for our people and brings them peace of mind. And that's what this whole piece is about. It is about bringing peace of mind to the people who built this country, people who continue to build this country, and saying, you know what? You're not going to have to rely on your children or your grandchildren if somehow you're not ready for retirement. What an incredible piece of legislation right now by all members of this committee, both past and present. This is a tremendous win for the American people. And I think if one thing, when we take the vote today, if nothing more than restoring the faith and confidence of the American people in our form of government, this is truly a great day for America. This is a fantastic day. The skies could not be bluer and the winds could not be stronger at our backs than what we're doing today for the American people. This truly is a red, white, and blue bill. This is something that secures the future for all Americans and brings peace of mind. This is an incredible opportunity. I got to tell you, I'm so glad that I'm here today to witness this. It's phenomenal. It is phenomenal. Let's just keep up the good work. Thanks so much to everybody on the committee and all the different provisions that you put in.
We thank the gentleman. We thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 2 points to make. The first is that I'm pleased that today's bill includes legislation that we all worked on, John Larson, Mike Kelly, Peter King, and myself, to allow volunteer firefighters and EMS personnel to receive benefits from the communities without being hit with a tax bill. These heroes should not be penalized for serving their communities. Mr. Chairman, as we move our first tax bills of the Congress, and today it's our, not one side or the other, I would be remiss not to urge the committee at this time to take up a fix to a problem that is devastating my home state, the egregious targeting of New Jersey and other states with the 2017 tax bill, capping the state and local tax deduction for the first time in the history of the United States with a deduction that goes back to the Civil War. Every county in New Jersey, except for one, has an average SALT deduction over the new $10,000 limit, with 80% of the households making under $200,000. In addition, the hastily crafted cap has a marriage penalty, so a married couple gets penalized versus a single person filing taxes. But more so than that, the SALT deduction allowed states to expend resources on critical public services and establish their own progressive income tax systems, ultimately reducing income inequality. I have a bill to restore the full deduction and at the same time restore the top individual income tax rate that Republicans lowered for no apparent reason in their tax bill, if you look at the literature before and after. If my friends on the other side of the aisle are so upset about the possibility that some wealthy taxpayers will receive a tax cut, and as they feigned last week in this committee, then they should support my bill, which brings back the top rate on high earners of 39.6%, while enabling states to have a progressive tax code. My friends across the aisle were so critical of restoring the SALT deduction, which produced $620 billion over a 10-year period, so that you could pay for you-know-what. They were silent when their tax law dropped the tax rate on the wealthiest Americans to 37%, or doubled the estate tax threshold so heirs in the top 1% could inherit $20 million from their parents before paying a single dime in taxes on their wealth. I think that's hypocrisy, filled with contradictions. And so, Mr. Chairman, I asked as a request, I think this is critical. More and more people are being affected, as all of you have been telling me.
Will the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
Mr. Pasquale, we know that the limitation on the SALT deduction is an important issue that the committee perhaps can address in this Congress. And you know that I've asked Mr. Thompson to convene a working group on the issue for members of our committee that are interested in solving this challenge. He is chairman of the Committee on Tax. And the President has indicated that he wants to provide folks who have been challenged by the cap on the SALT deduction with relief. So there will be an opportunity to continue to discuss this as we go forward.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
If I may. I want to thank you. I'm concerned, as mentioned, that the longer we wait, the more my state and other states will suffer in its ability to provide a top-notch education system, public safety system, roads and bridges, and local infrastructure projects. New Jerseyans and many others are looking to the Ways and Means Committee in this new Congress to provide relief. And I thank you, and I yield.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Buchanan, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say up front, I applaud your leadership. 3 new bills that are going to become law, in my opinion. And I appreciate the effort. You're reaching out on both sides of the aisle. I think it sets the right stage. And I can tell you in my area, and I think in most of Florida, people want us to get things done together. So I just want to say that right up front. But unfortunately today, there's too many hardworking Americans entering retirement without any savings. According to the U.S. today, the average American has less than $4,000 in savings, and a staggering 57% of adults have less than $1,000 to their name. I have one of the oldest districts. It's in the top 5. I can tell you I do a lot of town halls, and there's a lot of people that get to be 65, unfortunately, have little or nothing. So this will make a big difference, as Mr. Kelly says, encouraging people to start early. Also shocking, up to 35% of private businesses workers over the age of 22 work for a company that doesn't offer a retirement program. That's why for the past 3 Congresses, I've introduced bills with Ron Kind to make it easier for small businesses to offer retirement benefits to their employees. My bill with Ron over the years, I'm glad it got incorporated, the Retirement Security Americans Act, lets business join together in multiple employer plans to share the administrative burden and the cost of offering a retirement plan. According to the AARP, workers are 15 times more likely to save when they have access to a retirement plan. Millions of American employees stand to benefit from expanding the availability in the workplace for their retirement plan. I also want to thank and congratulate Mike Kelly and Ron Kind for their leadership on this bill. It'll make a huge difference to workers across America. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Mr. Kind as well. Included in this bill is a bill that I have been proud to champion for many years, and it deals with it adds a piece to this retirement package. My piece basically offers a simple yet very impactful way for small businesses across the country to better afford retirement plans for their employees. Under current law, each small business plan has to file a separate Form 5500, even though the information that they're filing can be nearly identical for small businesses that share a common plan administrator. And the change that is included in today's bill will allow a single Form 5500 to be filed by the common plan administrator. That way each individual doesn't have to do it. As we've heard over and over again on this dais from both sides of the aisle, too many Americans simply aren't putting enough money away to be able to afford a secure retirement. And by reducing costs and helping small businesses provide workplace retirement plans, we can allow millions of hardworking families a little more peace of mind. I'm proud to have led the fight to make it easier and less expensive for small businesses to establish retirement plans for their workers. Our goal today as a committee is to strengthen access to retirement security for hardworking Americans, and I'm proud that included in this bill, I have solved just one small piece of that puzzle. And with that, I thank the chairman again, and I yield back.
We thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this bipartisan markup. This is very promising, and we're very grateful. All of us in this committee definitely want to make sure all Americans have the opportunity to have a great retirement. And I'm encouraged to see us working together to give Americans the financial confidence they need as they start a new chapter in their lives. Saving for retirement should be a simple and hassle-free process, and that's why I support the SECURE Act. When we talk about retirement, we often forget the education component. I'm reminded of what a mentor had told me several years ago, that what you do in the first 25 years of your life determines how difficult or how easy the next 50 years of your life is. An investment in education is clearly an investment in the future, and that's why I'm thrilled that the legislation includes expanding 529 education savings accounts to include everyday K-12 education expenses, no matter where your child goes to school. The provision will allow public, private, religious, and homeschool students and families to save for the education expenses that pop up every day, like books, testing fees, and educational therapies for students with disabilities. It will help families afford an education customized for their child's unique needs. And with 75% of 529 plans assisting families making less than $150,000 a year, this legislation will help working and middle-class families save and prepare for their future. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I yield back.
We thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Del Bene, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and many thanks to Mr. Kind, Mr. Brady, and Mr. Kelly for their leadership on setting up Every Community for Retirement Enhancement Act. I'm proud that Washington State, along with my colleagues from California, have been leaders on ensuring that home health care workers are able to save for retirement. Home health care workers provide critical services for so many, including elderly and disabled members of our communities. Their service is vital to ensure that patients under their care can lead a dignified life. So it's only right that these workers are able to have a secure retirement. Unfortunately, a special tax rule that's intended to benefit certain home health care workers unintentionally prohibits other home health care workers from contributing to a retirement plan or IRA. I'm pleased that this bill fixes that inequity by allowing home health care workers to contribute to a defined contribution plan or IRA, ensuring they have the same opportunity to save for retirement as other workers. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentlelady, and with that, let me recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly applaud the work of the people who have contributed to this bill. Retirement planning is so important. You know, we have many people in our country who are inadequately prepared for retirement, and we need to do whatever we can to ease that, to encourage people to save. And most all of this bill is very well designed to do exactly that. I will say, however, that there is some really bad policy in this community newspaper pension fund relief, where we have newspapers, unfortunately, it's an unfortunate fact, community newspapers across this country are failing. They fail every day. And this provision is designed to protect only a few of these newspapers, some of which are owned by wealthy people, and basically what it allows them to do is to continue to underfund their pension plan. So this is really, really bad policy, and I just want to express my belief that I simply cannot support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
We thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank the ranking member also of this committee. I'd like to offer my support for the Secure Act of 2019. But I'd also like to thank Mr. Kind and Mr. Kelly for their leadership and their dedication. As a member who's relatively new to this committee, I think, as been stated, that's the kind of leadership we need. I currently serve as the Vice Chair of the Committee on Small Business. We held the hearing last Wednesday on unlocking small business retirement security, where we discussed the importance of supporting small employers and offering retirement saving plans to their employees. We also had a hearing in this committee back in February on the retirement security for American workers. I spoke on this same issue. Making it easier for small businesses to offer retirement saving plans is vital. It's vital not only to the benefit of these firms, but also to the people they employ, their families, and the communities they support. Currently, nearly half of all American private sector employees are not offered a retirement plan through their employers. Many of these employees are small businesses. In my home state of Pennsylvania, we have nearly 1 million small businesses employing 2.5 million workers, accounting for 46.7% of the workforce for the entire state. Small firms account for 99.6% of the state's employers. Across the U.S., there are nearly 30 million small businesses supporting almost 59 million jobs. Small firms accounting for approximately 99% of the U.S. businesses. Needless to say, small businesses are the drivers in our community, often filling spaces in our neighborhoods that large companies fail to reach. The Secure Act makes it easier for small businesses to offer retirement plans in a few key ways. The Secure Act multi-employer plan provision will make it easier for small businesses to sponsor retirement plans, provide an opportunity for small employers to band together to obtain more favorable pension investment results and more efficiency and less expensive management security. The Secure Act makes multi-employer plans more attractive by eliminating outdated barriers to use these plans. The Secure Act also includes small employers' automatic enrollment credit, automatic enrollment to show increase employees' participation in retirement savings. The Secure Act creates a new tax credit up to $500 per employer to cover startup costs for new Section 401k plans that include automatic enrollment. I appreciate having the opportunity to speak in support of this important piece of legislation to help ensure that every hardworking American, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to Springfield, Massachusetts, can retire secure, peace of mind, block by block. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple observations and then one comment on a provision. Look, the biggest issue for all of us, and it's going to be, I believe, will drive public policy the next couple decades, is the graying of America. Our society is getting old really fast. In 8.5 years, the last year of the baby boomers will be turning 65. So understand, in many ways, we're playing catch-up. Some of the things that are in this legislation, we should have done 20, 30 years ago. Thank you for putting it together. Thank you for doing it. But we're going to have a lot more to do. An observation, and we'll make a circle here. Having, with a couple other members of the committee, spent a year of my life on the multi-employer pension. Ultimately, what happened is the union, the business, the trustees agreed on rates of return that were unrealistic, and over time we wake up and the pensions are dramatically underfunded. Simplistic way to phrase it. I know we have the little tiny provision in here for a couple handfuls of community newspapers. You do see sort of the irony of we're doing retirement security at the same time we're creating a provision that for those employees of those small newspapers, their retirement security will become more fragile because we are going to allow systematic underfunding of those pensions. And we're not adding a provision that says if that newspaper files bankruptcy or something like that, that goes to the top of the credit stack. But I have to give one compliment on the concept that's been put in here, and that is for new employees of those small community newspapers that meet this definition, their yield on their pension will be sort of calculated off of a Treasury yield curve. That's actually a big deal because for those of us on the multi-employer, we talked about that for a year, that ultimately if we could socialize that concept, move that into policy, it would change the yield stretching that these pensions don't reach and creates an underfunded and creates an underfunded and creates an underfunded. So in a weird way, I don't know if these community newspapers are going to have many new employees, but the fact we're going to put it in statute that for those new employees, the way you calculated the funded for those employees portion is using a Treasury yield curve is a good thing. Now we have to take that policy and pull that through the rest of the multi-employer and other types. And could you imagine if we could even do that for other government pensions? If we really cared about retirement security, we'd actually start making the math make sense. And with that, yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and it is the chair's intention before the year is over to go hard to the multi-employer pension plan suggestions, largely because it has a ripple effect that goes right to PBGC. And working with the administration and Secretary Mnuchin, where the conversation has already ensued, there is an acknowledgement at Treasury that we're going to have to address that issue before the year is out. So I thank the gentleman for his comments. And without objection, I want to add to the record 25 letters in support of the Secure Act from organizations including AARP, ACLI, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, and the Church Alliances. And hearing no objection, those letters will be included. And with that, let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois to strike the last word, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to join in commending the chairman and the ranking member. This is an important day. It's a day that we demonstrate how Congress can and should operate. I am supportive of all three pieces of legislation that the committee is addressing today. I would like to share my appreciation that, in part, our first markup of this Congress is focused on the important issue of retirement security. A secure and dignified retirement is a core part of the American dream. For too many seniors, this dream is falling increasingly out of reach, so I am pleased we are taking action today with this legislation. It is also good to see that all three bills before the committee today are bipartisan and reflect how Ways and Means Committee members are able to work together to find solutions. I hope we will build on this cooperation to tackle other pressing issues in the future. In particular, I would like to reiterate my support for the Secure Act and to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member, as well as Mr. Kind and Mr. Kelly, for their leadership. Also, all of those who have contributed to make this legislation possible. I was proud to co-sponsor H.R. 1007, the Retirement Enhancement and Savings Act, many provisions of which were included in the Secure Act. This legislation will expand opportunities for Americans to increase their retirement savings, most importantly for employers and employees of small businesses, the engine of our economy. Thank you again, and I look forward to continuing our work on behalf of retirees and all Americans in the months ahead. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and with that, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I share my colleagues' sentiments that on balance this is really good legislation, and in fact I believe it will strengthen the retirement security of this great country and our fellow Americans, and I think it does incentivize Americans to save more and earlier for retirement, and that's a great thing. I understand, Mr. Chairman, that there is no such thing as perfect legislation for any of us, and in order to get to bipartisan outcomes, we have to have give and take, and I support that 100%. And I would join Mr. Kelly in waving the flag of bipartisanship and working in a constructive way to solve problems and move our country forward. Again, I'm all for that, and I'm going to support this because it's good legislation, and there's always debatable provisions of what's acceptable, what's good, what's great, but man, there's sometimes when there's just something that's just bad. It's bad for y'all, for us, for the entire country, and both sides have been guilty of allowing bad provisions into good pieces of legislation. So with that, I want to highlight something I strongly disapprove of for the record, Mr. Chairman, and that's this Section 115, the community newspaper pension relief. I can't think of, and I've racked my brain, and maybe any of my colleagues on the committee can help me, I can't think of one good public policy rationale to give a handful of newspaper companies special treatment in calculating the cost of their pension liabilities. I just can't think of one. This special interest provision is not just bad policy, it's bad precedent. And when we create laws that reward bad behavior, we create moral hazard. This isn't just bad for taxpayers, Mr. Chairman. This is bad for the employees. It puts them at risk because we give a pass to companies to not make good on their promises. And if we do this with this group, this handful of newspaper companies, why wouldn't we do it for everybody else that's found themselves in a pinch by not managing their business like they ought to? Maybe they overpromised. With that, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make that statement for the record, but I applaud your leadership here. I really do. And I'm excited about being a part as a new member of these three pieces of legislation, bipartisan legislation, that will move our country forward, that will strengthen America. God bless you. I appreciate it.
Thank the gentleman for his comments. And with that, let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I again want to reiterate our thanks to you for promoting bipartisanship in this committee, and I just want to repeat something I've said often before. We've seen tremendous growth in this country since the 1980s. We've seen a 1,200% increase in the Dow Jones. We've seen a 600% increase in the GDP, but workers' wages have not gone up. Workers' wages are less than 20% growth during that similar time period. And there's a lot of reasons for that: reductions in unionization, automation, globalization, the impacts of rising healthcare costs and prescription drug costs. And we're also seeing a decline in retirement savings by employees. As has been pointed out by several people here today, 55 million Americans do not have a retirement plan. And I think that everybody on this dais agrees, both Democrats and Republicans, that if you're willing to work 40 or 50 hours a week and you're willing to work 48 or 50 weeks a year, you should have a decent life. That's what America is about. You should be able to work hard, and in return for that, you make enough money so you have a place to live, you have health insurance, you can educate your children, and you can retire one day without being scared. I think all Democrats and Republicans believe that if you're willing to work hard in America, you should have a decent life. It's just not happening, and too many workers have been left behind, and unfortunately, we have not seen enough over the past 2 years to try and help workers get ahead. And I want to thank my colleagues here today for the bipartisan way that they're looking at supporting this legislation that's before us right now, because it is encouraging more working people in America to have an opportunity to save for their retirement. With that, I yield back, Mr.
Thank the gentleman. The chair will recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word, and I want to thank you for your leadership, obviously, on this, as well as Ranking Member Brady. And I want to echo the sentiments of most of the members, if not all of them, on this committee about the bipartisanship, something that obviously we hope continues not only in this committee, but transcends into the greater Congress. I want to thank the committee for accommodating the California and Washington delegations, and including in this legislation the fix for home health care workers, something that would otherwise, those people who would otherwise be unable to participate in retirement plans through CalSavers, which is California's state retirement savings program. These workers, as I saw firsthand growing up, provide critical services for the elderly and disabled in our communities and deserve to be able to save for retirement using the same plans as others in the CalSavers program. My state, California, was trying to do the right thing and make retirement saving easier for these workers, and I'm glad that we are able to move along a fix that will prevent a technical issue from harming these important workers' ability to pursue a secure retirement. Mr. Chairman, thank you once again, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, the chair would recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I offer my strong support of H.R. 1994, the SECURE Act. One of the many reasons for supporting this bill is, in addition to serving on the Ways and Means Committee, I am also a member of the Small Business Committee. And I've heard directly from employers who would like to offer retirement savings to their employees, but struggle to overcome red tape and financial barriers in doing so. In fact, nearly half of American private sector employees, roughly 55 million, work for an employer that does not offer a retirement plan. But we know that if workers are offered a plan through their employer, they're much more likely to save than they would through establishing their own IRA. That's why I'm glad this bill includes Mr. Kind's provision to provide an opportunity for small employers to band together to obtain more favorable pension investment results and less expensive management services. That'll make it so much easier for small businesses to offer plans to their employees. And I'm also pleased that this legislation expands the credit to offset startup costs for small businesses who set up these retirement plans, making the process more affordable and accessible. Additionally, it creates a $500 credit for employers who offer 401k and simple IRA plans that auto-enroll their employees. It's clear that automatic enrollment increases employee participation and results in higher retirement savings. And that'll help more Americans access plans to save for their futures and establish financial security. Lastly, I'd like to thank the committee for working swiftly to resolve a problem facing low-income home health care workers in my home state. Home health care workers, 90% of whom are women, and more than half of whom are women of color, often struggle to save for retirement. But some states like California and Washington have established plans to address this issue and allow all workers access to a retirement account. But due to an error in the code, certain home health care workers are unable to participate in these statewide plans. The SECURE Act fixes this glitch by including language from legislation introduced by Representatives Schreier and Delbene, of which I am an original co-sponsor. I'm so glad to be addressing all these pressing issues, and through this legislation, workers will face a more secure retirement, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Let us recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Murphy, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I want to commend you, Ranking Member Brady, and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their work on the Secure Act, which will make important reforms to our retirement security system. I just want to take a quick moment to highlight Section 111 of the bill, which is the text of a bill I recently introduced. This provision would allow long-term part-time workers to participate in 401k plans. Under the current law, employers may generally exclude part-time employees when providing a defined contribution plan to their employees. This affects many workers, especially women, because women are more likely than men to work part-time. So the current rules can be quite harmful for women as they try to prepare for retirement. I think it's important to provide the opportunity for as many workers as reasonably possible to personally prepare for their own secure and dignified retirement. And for that, I'm grateful to see this provision included. With that, I thank the chairman and I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Anybody else who would like to be recognized? If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Now let me recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Lewis, for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1994 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill, H.R. 1994, as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1994, as amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, and dissenting or minority views. The next order of business is H.R. 1957, the Taxpayer First Act of 2019, which will improve IRS customer service and dispute resolution, provide additional taxpayer protections in connections and enforcement, and provide flexibility for IRS redesign. I will now turn to Mr. Lewis, the lead sponsor and unwavering supporter of the Taxpayer First Act, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup today. I'm pleased that the committee is considering the Taxpayer First Act 2019. This is not a Republican or a Democratic bill. It is an American one. I would like to begin by thanking Chairman Neal, Ranking Member Brady, Oversight Subcommittee Ranking Member Kelly, and all members of the Subcommittee on Oversight for joining us on this bill. I'd like to thank Mr. Buchanan, who started with us some time ago. As many of you know, Chairman Grassley and Ranking Member Wyden introduced the companion bill in the Senate last week. I would also like to congratulate all of the House members and senators who have bills and ideas that are included in the Taxpayer First Act. This bill is a result of many hearings, thoughtful oversight, and help from stakeholders. Our common goal was and remain in this Congress finding ways to help American taxpayers. During this time of the year when tens of millions of Americans are working to file their taxes by April 15th, I'm very proud of our work to improve taxpayer service, protect taxpayers during enforcement, and enhancing the appeal process. Many of you know that early this year, the National Taxpayer Advocate announced her retirement. She has served this country for nearly 20 years, has been a voice for taxpayers within the agency. I'm pleased that many of her ideas are also included in this bill. The Taxpayer First Act also contains many good common sense policies that are important to all of our taxpayers. For example, the bill provides for matching grant for the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, which helps low-income and moderate-income taxpayers complete and file their taxes. The bill also ensures that these taxpayers are directly toward low-income tax clinic for help when they are trying to resolve tax issues. Further, I'm proud that this bill protects certain low-income taxpayers and recipients of Social Security disability insurance benefit from the private debt collection program. The change responds to independent reports all about this program. The Taxpayer First Act served as an example of the good and the thoughtful policy that Congress can produce when both the process and the product are bipartisan. And that's what we have in this bill. With this bill, we show taxpayers that their frustration does not fall on deaf ears. With this bill, Congress heard their concern, their cries, and responded to their call to action. Mr. Chairman, this bill should be an inspiration to us all. In closing, I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support Taxpayer First Act. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank and acknowledge the gentleman's perseverance on this legislation. Now let me recognize the bill's original co-sponsor, who also has worked great effort on both sides on this legislation for a considerable period of time, Mr. Kelly, for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we could just take 1 second. You know, a lot of us get credit for a lot of things that get done, but the folks sitting behind us right now are incredible on what they're able to do. So if they could just stand up for a minute, all of you who are involved in this, please just stand up for a minute, because we really appreciate everything you do. I want to give you a hand for what you do. Come on, staff, you were so shy. And I especially want to thank, where's Lori Prater? She's out there somewhere. She's busy talking over there. Hey, Lori Prater. We're talking about you. Thanks so much. You are our Girl Friday and all this, so thanks so much. And I just think that sometimes we forget how this all works, but especially my friend, John Lewis. What a great honor it is to work with you on this piece. I think the real, I know we're calling it the Taxpayer First Act. Maybe what we should do is we're going to switch the tone of things. Instead of saying, and being afraid to say this, we're going to say it proudly. We're from the government and we're here to help you. It's one of those most dreaded things you can hear from anybody. If you get I tell people, if you get a call from the IRS, it's not the IRS. You got to get a letter. But what we're trying to do with this is reform the IRS where it becomes a customer service, not a complaint department. It has to be an enforcement department. It has to be a collection department. But no taxpayer, no American citizen should ever be struck with fear because somebody from the IRS contacted and said, "Oh my God, what do I do now? Find a lawyer." We don't want that to happen. So, having said all that, today is one of those remarkable days. I got to tell you, I feel so good about today because we're doing these things together. I mean, we're looking across each other. We're actually smiling at each other, and we're giving each other thumbs up. Do you know how important this is to the American people to know that we're on their side? This is incredible. Not just, as Republicans and Democrats, but more importantly, as elected representatives of the people back home. The people who sent us to represent them and act in their best interest and not in our best interest. I mean, it's an incredible day. I think Mr. Lewis has touched on so many things, but the first, as mentioned, the bill places emphasis on customer service. I know in the retail business, they used to have complaint departments. They're now customer service. This is what it should always be. It should always be about customer service, taking care of those that take care of the whole nation. That's all their revenue that runs this wonderful machine. And secondly, we're overhauling the IRS enforcement tools so families and small businesses can have property seized without fair notice and due process. I know in the past we had oversight committee hearings and people would come in with horrible things that happened to them. I'm not talking about big corporations. I'm talking about mom and pop organizations, somebody that has a dry cleaning, somebody has a dress shop, somebody that has a little farm and does things, and all of a sudden their assets get seized. It's a horrible thing to do to people, absolutely horrible thing to do it. And no wonder Americans, they're struck with fear when they get this letter from the IRS. We're trying to change that. We're trying to change that so the people that truly supply every single penny, they're the people we should show the most respect to, shouldn't we? Shouldn't we? I think we are. Sir, and the Taxpayer First Act directs the IRS to see itself not as an enforcement agency, right, but also as our tax administrator. My goodness, what could be more difficult than to look at a couple thousand pages and say, I think I got this down? Because I do it once a year, and I know I'm sure I'm hitting I'm crossing every T and I'm dotting every I, and I'm not making any mistakes. So we're trying to make it that it's a customer service organization. And then we're revamping the IRS's, I guess we call it ancient technology. There'd be very few people in the private sector would look at what the IRS is working with and say, you know what, they're pretty much up to date, man. They're caught up on everything. We have technology today that made things possible that we never thought possible in the past, and yet the IRS is using things that nobody would use in the private sector. At least they wouldn't use it long because they couldn't stay in business. There's so many things we're trying to do with this, and I think that, again, there's no time in any American's life that they should be struck with fear because they got a letter from the IRS or they got a visit. It truly has to become a customer service-centered organization. And again today, but these three pieces of legislation, and Mr. Kind hit on it earlier.
Will the gentleman yield for a second?
Yes, I will.
In the spirit of the gentleman's remarks, I think we should also acknowledge the wonderful work that Nina Olson has done at the Taxpayer Advocate's Office. She's announced her retirement. A lot of the work that she did and the ideas that she brought to this committee is being incorporated in this legislation, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't recognize Nina today and the work that she's done throughout the years. I yield back.
You're so right, Mr. Kind. And Mr. Lewis, in our oversight committee, we did have Ms. Olson, and she gave us some ideas about going into the future. She's a tremendous advocate for the American people. But more than anything else, I want to go back to what Mr. Kind said earlier today. This restores the faith that the American people need to have in our form of government. We're doing things today that just makes sense for Americans. It has nothing to do with your political party, how you vote, how you're registered. It has to do with who you are as part of this country. So this is a great day for all of us and a great day for America. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for bringing it forward. Mr. Brady, also thank you for staying the course too and making sure we get to this point. Mr. Kind, look forward to the rest of our time together here to keep doing things that make sense for all the people we represent. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1957. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and consider the base text for the purpose of amendment. Let me now turn to Mr. Barthold, the Staff Director of the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on changes made in the introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Chairman Neal. The members of the committee have before them three joint committee documents, JCX 15, which describes the underlying legislation, JCX 16, which describes the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute, which is really only making a clerical change, and JCX 17, which provides the staff's estimates of the budgetary effects of the provisions within the legislation. The Taxpayer First Act of 2019 has a number of provisions, both related to current IRS procedures and plans for the future of the IRS. I'll highlight a few of them. Among changes that would be made in sort of current IRS procedures, the legislation makes changes to the seizure requirements in so-called structuring transactions by requiring that an underlying crime be identified in order to justify the seizure of assets. And it also provides that in the case of a wrongful seizure, when funds are returned to the taxpayer, that the interest paid on those funds by the government to the taxpayer will be tax-free. Significantly, the legislation also makes reforms to the private debt collection provisions of the code. It generally exempts all taxpayers with the most recent year's adjusted gross income of less than 200% of the poverty line from being in the pool of cases that are turned over to private debt collection agencies. There are also changes made providing for longer installment periods to be allowed in settling private debt collection cases, and it narrows the number of eligible cases in terms of the age of cases that are turned over to private debt collection agencies. Looking towards more towards the future, the legislation creates an independent office of appeals within the IRS and establishes a right to an independent appeals process for all taxpayers. It would provide taxpayers with access to his or her case file, and it requires that the Commissioner of the IRS provide an annual report explaining any such denials under this appeals process. The legislation further requires the Commissioner to submit a comprehensive plan for the entire reorganization of the Internal Revenue Service. That plan for reorganization is due by September 30th of 2020. It further requires that within 1 year from the date of enactment of the Taxpayer First Act that the Commissioner submit a plan for enhancing customer service. Provides also within 1 year from date of enactment a report on a revised comprehensive personnel training strategy for employees within the IRS. It would also require a speed up in the requirements of present law for the expanded use of electronic filing by taxpayers. It would provide that within 2 years, a report on enhancing electronic payment with improved anti-fraud procedures, cybersecurity, and reaching more taxpayers with electronic payment means. And it would also provide, among other requirements, that within 5 years, the IRS develop an elective IP PIN program, a two-factor identification procedure to help combat fraud and ID theft. That's a brief overview of this legislation. I'd be happy to provide any answers or more detail that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Chair would recognize Mr. Davis to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I applaud the Taxpayer First Act for its prioritization of taxpayer needs. In particular, I appreciate your leadership to prevent private debt collectors from pursuing tax collections from individuals and families earning under 250% of the federal poverty level and persons receiving disability. Further creating an independent appeals process, improving the Officer in Compromise program, and modernizing the IRS are overdue improvements. I thank Chairman Lewis and Ranking Member Kelly as well for advancing the Vita Permanence Act. I thank Congressman Winthrop for his partnership in championing this crucial program that provides high-quality tax help to hard-working families so that they can keep more of their hard-earned money. The Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, or VITA, offers free tax services to people who make less than 250% of the poverty level and to underserved taxpayers, including persons with disabilities, the elderly, and limited English speakers. It is a prime example of smart federal investment because each federal dollar is matched by the private sector. For example, 380 United Ways across the United States invest $17 million in free tax preparation services to match the VITA grants. There are VITA sites in every state across the country, more than 3,700 in total, that prepared over 1.3 million tax returns in the 2017 tax filing season with a 94% accuracy, helping tax filers access $1.9 billion in tax refunds. VITA sites are skilled at ensuring that taxpayers get all of the tax benefits for which they are eligible. These savings, coupled with the savings of hundreds of dollars in tax preparation costs, put more money in my constituents' pockets to cover essential costs like rent, groceries, utility bills, and medical care. H.R. 1957 makes important changes to the VITA program. For example, in addition to permanently authorizing VITA The bill allows the Secretary to fund the VITA grants up to $30 million. We've fully exhausted the recent appropriations of $15 million. The Internal Revenue Service estimates that 70% of Americans are eligible to file their taxes for free. From 2011 to 2018, the number of VITA participants increased by almost 50%, from 964,000 to 1.3 million. Given the high demand and need, H.R. 1957 recognizes that the IRS put taxpayers first by giving them access to high-quality free services, doubling our federal investment via this quality matching grant program. As I close, I want to recognize the wonderful VITA sites in Chicago, the Center for Economic Progress, the Citywide Tax Assistance Program via Ladder Up, and the United Way Metropolitan Chicago Clinics. I'm grateful for their presence in Chicago and tip my hat to the United Way and Prosperity Now for their leadership on VITA performance. I thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member, for your leadership and urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Wolarski, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's definitely a trust gap between taxpayers and the IRS, and the IRS's information technology systems are a great example of why. The IRS has an urgent need to overhaul its IT systems, some of which date back to the Kennedy administration, but repeated mistakes, both big and small, undermine our trust in them. Take the $12 million they spent on a new email system they couldn't use. The Inspector General report revealed the IRS bought it, quote, without first determining project and infrastructure needs, integration requirements, business requirements, and whether the subscriptions were technologically even feasible. Or take the Return Review Program, or the RRP. The new fraud detection program came in years behind schedule and hundreds of millions of dollars over budget. Here are just a few of the reasons the IRS cited when it put the RRP into a strategic pause in 2014. They said it was to determine the priority and direction from IRS senior leadership. They said to articulate and align on RRP's role in the broader business vision. They also said to ensure clear and concise understanding of scope, cost, and schedule with contractors. And finally, budgetary constraints. It's clear that unforced errors are turning vital projects into boondoggles. We could be applauding the IRS right now for buying a system off the shelf. Instead, we're scolding them for not asking the most basic questions before buying it. I hear complaints about the IRS's budget, and I think about that RRP. Senior leadership gave no direction, no one knew how to fit it into the big picture, and contractors were totally out of the loop. Everyone essentially ran in circles until they ran out of money. You know what? Here's what we do know. More money cannot fix failed leadership or a broken culture. Better guidelines, codified rules, and more intentional strategic planning can. That's why last Congress I introduced H.R. 5362, the IRS Information Technology Accountability Act, and I was happy to see the critical work being built on in this Congress with the introduction and markup of the Taxpayer First Act. I truly believe if we do instill more accountability, better contracting practices, and better strategic planning, the IRS really can get on the right path. At the end of the day, this will greatly benefit the American taxpayer and ensure that the IRS is working for them in an effective way. I'm proud that we're taking important bipartisan steps to close the IRS's trust gap. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1957, the Taxpayer First Act. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair would recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chair, I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Taxpayer First Act of 2019. The last time Congress considered sweeping changes to the IRS was in 1998, 21 years ago. Considering the operations of this agency affects every single taxpayer in this country, I believe the legislation is long overdue. This bill takes broad steps to improve the taxpayer experience by making the filing process easier and more efficient. It also strengthens the IRS's ability to combat identity theft and refund fraud. These are issues that worry, stress, and create headaches for our constituents, and I'm pleased that this committee's first markup includes solutions to these common problems. I've also long been concerned about the IRS private debt collection program. Through this program, the IRS outsources its debt collection to private contractors, but they often use aggressive tactics to target the poorest and most vulnerable amongst us. They've even targeted survivors of natural disasters like devastating hurricanes. For example, the contractors push people to make payments even if they can't afford it. This creates economic hardships for individuals and families who would otherwise qualify for alternative payment plans by the IRS. The taxpayer advocate, Nina Olson, has consistently raised concerns about this program and stated that low-income taxpayers make up most of the cases sent to these debt collectors. And what's worse is that this program costs the U.S. Treasury more than the money it even brings in. I believe this program should be abolished for good, but I'm pleased that we were able to reach a bipartisan deal to permanently exclude those who have an AGI of 200% of the federal poverty level and those with substantial income from supplemental security or disability insurance benefits from these collection practices. This is a step in the right direction, and I'm supportive of the compromise. And I thank my colleague, Chairman Lewis of our Oversight Committee, for working diligently to compile these reforms. And I offer my strong support for this package. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Winstrup, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a moment to thank the members and staff of this committee on both sides of the aisle for their work on the pieces of legislation that we considered here today. A lot of work has gone into these bills. I'm glad to see these common sense provisions getting one step closer to the finish line. I also want to highlight a provision in the Taxpayer First Act, a provision that would codify the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance, or VITA, matching grant program and make it permanent. My colleague, Dr. Danny Davis, and I have been working on this together on this standalone legislation to make VITA permanent, and I'm very pleased to see the provisions included in today's package. VITA centers provide tax help without any fee to low-income individuals, persons with disabilities, and limited English-speaking taxpayers who need assistance with their taxes. These centers, with so many volunteers, assist thousands of constituents every year. And by making this program permanent, we'll be able to provide VITA organizations and the taxpayers they serve with much certainty going forward. So I'm glad to see this important provision included today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair would recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, at the risk of being repetitive, I want to thank you again for promoting the bipartisanship here today with the third bill that we're supporting on a bipartisan nature here today, and thanking the ranking member as well. I also want to thank Chairman Lewis and Ranking Member Kelly for their work on this particular bill. The IRS is broken. It's getting worse. There was a 200% increase in errors filed this year so far based upon the new tax bill that was supposed to simplify filings. There's been a 200% increase in errors. And the IRS is also not doing as great a job as we needed to do regarding audits and regarding customer service. In fact, as part of the testimony from the taxpayer advocate, we discovered that the IRS only answers 18% of the calls that it receives, and the calls that they do answer are after a 17-minute wait period. Imagine a taxpayer calling up, trying to get assistance, and they have to wait for 17 minutes. Most of them drop off, and only 18% of the calls get answered. This Taxpayer First Act, under the leadership of Chairman Lewis and Ranking Member Kelly, is a good step forward. I want to thank Congressman LaHood, who asked me to join him in a piece of legislation to empower taxpayers and to require the IRS to answer taxpayer assistance directives that are offered from the taxpayer advocate within a timely period, and take actions to try and address the concerns that are raised by the taxpayer advocate. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. If there are no further requests to strike the last word, are there any requests for amendments in the question of the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. Now let me recognize Mr. Lewis for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1957 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Thank the gentleman. The question is on favorably reporting the bill, 1957 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1957 as amended is ordered favorably to the House. And just as we conclude, let me thank the staff on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, for the accomplishment that we've all witnessed here today. Without objection, that staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned. Thanks, John. That was great.
Thank you,
Good
Mr.
job.
Chairman.
Good job, Kel.
Congratulations, Chairman.
Thank you.